Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. Tonight we examine a weathered photograph that captures a moment of inexplicable terror in a place meant for solemn farewell. The photograph dates to 1903, the sepia tones having faded over the decades into haunting whispers of what once was. It depicts the interior of a small stone church, its Gothic arches framing a scene of interrupted mourning. Rows of wooden pews filled with parishioners in dark Victorian mourning attire face toward the altar, where a simple wooden coffin rests on a bier. What makes this image particularly disturbing is the visible commotion captured by the camera. In the foreground, several attendees appear to be rising from their seats, faces contorted in expressions of shock and fear. The priest, identifiable by his vestments, stands at the head of the coffin with his arms outstretched, his face a mask of disbelief. The photograph seems to have been taken at precisely the moment when something unthinkable occurred during what should have been a routine funeral service. According to the few surviving accounts associated with this image, the funeral was for a young woman from a prominent local family. Her death had been attributed to consumption, common enough in those days. The service had proceeded normally until the priest began the final blessing. Witness statements claim that several attendees heard sounds coming from within the coffin, faint at first, then growing more insistent. The priest, initially determined to continue the service, reportedly went pale when he observed what he later described as an unmistakable movement beneath the coffin lid. What makes this case particularly compelling is that the priest, a man of considerable standing in the community and not known for flights of fancy, provided a sworn affidavit about what he witnessed. "I have served God faithfully for 30 years, his statement reads, "and never have I spoken falsely." The coffin moved. Something within was trying to escape. The photograph was taken by an attendee who had brought a camera to document the funeral of the beloved community member. Instead, he captured something far more disturbing, a moment of collective horror when the boundary between life and death seemed to blur. What happened next remains unclear. Some accounts suggest the service was hastily concluded, the coffin sealed and quickly interred, despite protests from several witnesses. Others claim the coffin was opened, though what was found inside varies wildly depending on the source. The church where this incident occurred still stands in a small village in northern England, though it was partially rebuilt after a fire in 1927. Local residents speak of strange sounds that echo through the nave during funeral services, particularly when young women are being laid to rest. Was this a case of premature burial, that most Victorian of fears, or something more sinister? The faces of those in attendance, frozen in that moment of dawning horror, suggest they witnessed something that defied simple explanation, something that continues to echo through time in this single, disturbing image. The archives of the County Historical Society yielded unexpected treasures when I began investigating the incident. Buried among tax records and parish registers, I discovered the journal of Dr. Thomas Harrington, the physician who had pronounced the young woman, Elizabeth Caldwell, dead 3 days before her funeral. His clinical notes betray a growing unease in the days following her death. "Miss Caldwell presents with all signs of mortal cessation," he wrote the day after her passing, "yet her complexion retains a quality most unusual. Her lips maintain a faint hue that defies explanation." By the day of the funeral, he had visited the body 3 times, each time recording his certainty of death while noting increasingly troubling observations. The Caldwell family had been prominent landowners in the region since the early 1800s. Elizabeth, at just 22, had been engaged to the son of a neighboring estate, creating a union that would have consolidated considerable wealth. Her consumption diagnosis came after months of declining health, pallor, and lethargy. What struck me as peculiar was the haste with which the funeral was arranged. Victorian customs typically allowed for several days of wake and viewing. Elizabeth was to be buried merely 72 hours after her pronounced death, an unusual acceleration that Dr. Harrington questioned in his private writings. I found census records listing the Caldwell household staff, including a maid named Mary Sutton who provided testimony to the local newspaper weeks after the incident. "Miss Elizabeth had taken to walking at night for months before her passing," Mary reported, "returning with dirt on her hems and a color in her cheeks I never saw in daylight." The village constable's report offers the most clinical account of what followed the disruption. After the photographer captured the chaotic scene, the church emptied in panic save for the priest, the gravediggers, and Elizabeth's father. According to the constable, Upon opening of the casket, the deceased appeared undisturbed, showing no signs of life or movement. Yet he noted the coffin lining had been disturbed, with scratch marks visible on the satin interior. Most telling was a telegram I discovered sent by Elizabeth's fiancé to his parents the evening after the funeral. He had been traveling abroad and absent from the service. The message read only, "Wedding cancelled. Do not inquire further. Returning home forthwith." The church records show the priest, Father Michael Collins, requested reassignment mere weeks after the incident. His letter to the bishop cited, "A crisis of faith brought on by witnessing that which cannot be reconciled with God's natural order." He served the remainder of his vocation at a monastery in Scotland, never again overseeing funeral rites. Local newspapers fell strangely silent on the matter after initial reports suggesting influence from the Caldwell family. However, death records show 5 unexplained deaths in the village over the following winter months, each victim discovered with extreme pallor and unexplained wounds to the throat. The Caldwell family crypt was sealed with iron in 1904 by order of the village council. No official reason was recorded, but the blacksmith's invoice remains, noting the unusual thickness of the bars and the special lock commissioned at tremendous expense. I traveled to the village graveyard on the anniversary of Elizabeth's funeral, drawn by rumors of annual gatherings at her grave. The cemetery keeper, a man in his 70s named Harold Finch, reluctantly agreed to share what he knew after I pressed several sovereign coins into his weathered palm. "My grandfather tended these grounds when the Caldwell girl was buried," Harold whispered, glancing nervously at the sealed family crypt across the cemetery. "He never spoke of it until his deathbed. Said they didn't bury her with the family." "Not really." Harold led me to an unmarked plot distant from the Caldwell crypt, beneath an ancient yew tree. The earth seemed oddly settled, as if it had never been properly disturbed. Grandfather said they performed the public burial at the crypt, but under cover of night, the priest and Mr. Caldwell brought something here. A sealed lead box. Small. Too small for a body. Unless it wasn't intact, I thought grimly. In the local archives, I discovered a forgotten invoice from a metallurgist in Sheffield, commissioned by the Caldwell family 1 week after the funeral. The order was for a container impervious to all elements, lined with silver and blessed materials, suitable for containment of biological specimens. The village library yielded Elizabeth's personal correspondence, preserved by a historical society volunteer who'd saved them from being destroyed during the hasty sale of the Caldwell estate in 1905. Her letters revealed a young woman transformed in the months before her death. "I hunger for something beyond this provincial life," she wrote to a school friend. "Since meeting the Count during our Italian tour, I've felt awakened to possibilities Mother would find most shocking. He has promised to show me a world beyond the veil of our mundane existence." Most disturbing was her final letter, never sent, dated 3 days before her diagnosed consumption reached its supposed fatal conclusion. "The transformation comes soon. The Count's essence flows within me now. He assures me the death will be merely transitional. Should I appear to expire, do not grieve. I shall rise renewed, though I may require sustenance immediately upon awakening." The appointed village doctor after Harrington's sudden retirement was Jacob Mercer, whose medical logs contain coded entries about the Caldwell contagion and preventative measures applied to vulnerable residents. These measures included garlic poultices, blessed silver coins placed under tongues, and windows sealed with specific herbs. Church renovation records from 1927 reveal the fire that damaged the building wasn't accidental. Insurance investigators determined it began in the underground crypt where Elizabeth was initially laid before her midnight relocation. The report mentions extensive scratching on interior stone walls and unusual residue found amid the ashes. Most chilling was my discovery in the personal effects of the photographer who captured the funeral disruption. His diary, donated to the Historical Society by his granddaughter, contained a final entry dated exactly 1 year after the funeral. "She came to my window last night. Elizabeth, unchanged, smiling, asking to be invited in. I refused. Tonight I shall not sleep. The silver cross burns against my chest as I write these words. God forgive us all for what we allowed to enter our village." The entry ends mid-sentence. The photographer was found the following morning, drained of blood, his camera clutched in rigor-stiffened fingers. The film inside, when developed, showed only a pale figure with familiar eyes, caught in eternal hunger. The village archives offered one final, troubling document, the original death certificate for Elizabeth Caldwell, signed by Dr. Harrington. Upon close examination under specialized light, I discovered a second diagnosis faintly visible beneath the official consumption cause of death, exsanguination of unknown origin. This revelation led me to seek out the last living connection to the Caldwell family. Marjorie Wells, now 97, was the daughter of Elizabeth's cousin. I found her in a nursing home 40 miles from the village, her mind remarkably sharp despite her advanced years. "We weren't supposed to speak of Elizabeth," Marjorie told me, her voice dropping to a whisper, though we were alone in her room. "But Mother told me everything when I turned 16, said a girl should know what dangers lurk in charming foreign men." According to Marjorie, Elizabeth had met the so-called Count not in Italy as her letters suggested, but in London during the season. He had attended several society functions, though strangely, he appeared in none of the society photographs. Mother said he cast no reflection, but people dismissed her as hysterical when she mentioned it. The Count had given Elizabeth a gift, a small vial of crimson liquid she consumed in private. Household staff reported hearing her violent retching through the night, followed by days of fever that the family attributed to a passing illness. They thought she'd recovered, Marjorie explained, but she was different afterward, cold to the touch. She ate nothing at family meals, yet looked somehow healthier. Mother noticed she no longer ventured out in daylight. I presented Marjorie with a photograph of Elizabeth from before her illness. She pushed it away with trembling hands. "That's not her. Not the Elizabeth I remember visiting our home that final month. This girl's eyes are alive." The village church renovation plans from 1927 revealed another detail the historical accounts had omitted: the addition of specially designed stained glass. I obtained photographs of the windows commissioned from a glassmaker in Prague known for religious iconography. The central panel depicted St. Michael not with his usual dragon, but standing victorious over a pale, feminine figure with a wooden stake driven through her heart. The church accounting ledgers listed an unusual donor for these windows, the Harrington family. Dr. Thomas Harrington, it seemed, had not retired, but rather dedicated his remaining years to the study of obscure medical conditions and folkloric remedies. His private medical library, donated to the university upon his death, contained dozens of books on rare blood disorders and Eastern European legends. Most revealing was the parish death registry I found, water-damaged and nearly illegible, in the church basement. In the margins next to Elizabeth's entry, the priest had written a single Latin phrase: "Non corpus, non anima, sed umbra," neither body nor soul, but shadow. The final piece came from an unexpected source, a museum of photographic history displaying the camera that captured the infamous funeral disruption. The curator allowed me to examine it under controlled conditions. Hidden within the bellows, preserved for over a century, I found a single human tooth, filed to an unnatural point, with traces of what modern analysis confirmed was human blood in the enamel. The photograph continues to yield its secrets, though the most illuminating evidence came not from the image itself, but from an unmarked leather-bound journal discovered during the demolition of the Caldwell summer cottage in 1962. The journal belonged to Elizabeth's younger sister, Catherine, who had been sent to relatives in America shortly after the funeral incident. Catherine's entries begin as typical adolescent musings, but transform after Elizabeth's supposed death. "I know what they did to her," she wrote 3 months after the funeral. "Father believes the abomination destroyed, but I heard them, the maid and the groundskeeper whispering about the sounds beneath the yew. They say the lead box moves on moonless nights." Most disturbing are Catherine's detailed sketches of her sister in the weeks before her diagnosis. Elizabeth's fingernails, rendered in meticulous detail, appear elongated and almost claw-like. A close study of her eyes shows pupils drawn as vertical slits like those of a cat, or something far less natural. I've consulted specialists in Victorian-era diseases, and none can reconcile Elizabeth's symptoms with consumption or any known malady of the time. Dr. Eleanor Pritchard, an expert in historical pathology, examined the records I'd gathered and offered a disturbing theory. These symptoms suggest a parasitic invasion of the bloodstream, altering the host's physiology at a fundamental level. Nothing in 19th century medicine could have addressed such a condition. The village parish records reveal another curious detail. In the months following Elizabeth's burial, livestock in surrounding farms died mysteriously. their bodies found drained of blood with small, precise wounds on their necks. Farmers began slaughtering animals at sunset and keeping them secured through the night. This practice continued for generations without explanation, becoming simply the way things are done, until mechanized farming practices arrived in the 1950s. I interviewed Margaret Holloway, great-granddaughter of the funeral photographer, who shared a family heirloom passed down with strict instructions never to open it. Inside the sealed envelope was a single photographic plate, separately preserved from the infamous funeral image. This second photograph, taken moments after the first, shows the coffin lid distinctly raised by several inches, a slender, pale hand visible at its edge. The image quality is poor, yet the long, claw-like fingernail is unmistakable. Most significant was my discovery within church attendance records. After Elizabeth's funeral, the village population attended services with unprecedented regularity. Even known atheists and religious skeptics appeared each Sunday without fail for nearly 5 years. The church warden's notes indicate doors were locked precisely at sundown, with armed men stationed outside until morning prayers concluded. When I returned to the cemetery at dusk, Harold Finch was waiting with a tarnished silver key. My grandfather said this opened something beneath the U, said I'd know when the right person came asking. His hand trembled as he pressed it into my palm. Some things stay buried for good reason. They found Elizabeth's fiancé, 3 days after he sent that telegram, in a roadside ditch with his throat torn out. They never recorded his death properly. Family was too influential to have such a scandal. As darkness fell, the key grew cold in my pocket. The decision to turn it in whatever lock awaited beneath the ancient tree would shape not just my understanding of this historical footnote, but potentially my very survival. The key burned with unnatural cold against my palm as I knelt beneath the ancient yew tree. Moonlight filtered through gnarled branches, casting writhing shadows across the unmarked earth. Harold had departed hastily, making the sign of the cross before disappearing beyond the cemetery gates. After careful examination of the ground, I discovered a small iron ring nearly consumed by soil and roots. Centuries of growth had almost completely concealed what appeared to be a trapdoor, its existence deliberately obscured by time and nature. The silver key slid into a hidden lock with disturbing ease, as though it had been waiting. The mechanism turned with a sound like breaking bones. What lay beneath was not a burial chamber, but a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. The air that rushed upward carried the scent of stagnant earth and something metallic, old blood, perhaps, or oxidized iron. Against all better judgment, I descended. At the bottom, a small chamber had been carved from the living rock, its walls inscribed with symbols I recognized from Dr. Harrington's occult medical texts. In the center stood a pedestal supporting a lead box precisely as Harold's grandfather had described, small, sealed, and bound with silver chains that had partially corroded over the decades. Most disturbing was the condition of those chains. They showed signs of strain, as though something inside had tested their strength repeatedly over the years. Deep scratches marked the stone floor around the pedestal, radiating outward like desperate attempts to escape. My recorder captured a sound that only became apparent upon later analysis. A faint rhythmic tapping from within the box, too regular to be settling metal, too deliberate to be anything but conscious. I found a letter tucked beneath the pedestal, preserved in oilskin, written in Father Colin's distinctive hand. We could not destroy it. God forgive us. We tried. Fire would not consume her remains. Dismemberment did not stop the movement. Even separated, the parts sought to reunite. This chamber, blessed by 7 priests and sealed with silver from Jerusalem's temple, must contain what we cannot eliminate. The head alone remains animate, the eyes still open, the teeth still snap. May God have mercy on the soul of Elizabeth Caldwell, if any remains within this abomination. As I read these words, the tapping from the box grew more insistent, as though responding to the name. I backed toward the stairs, unwilling to test the integrity of century-old restraints. The village record suddenly made perfect sense, not just a community traumatized by unexplained events, but one knowingly standing guard over imprisoned evil, their church attendance a weekly renewal of protection rather than simple devotion. In my haste to exit, I stumbled against the pedestal. The box shifted slightly and the tapping ceased immediately. In the silence that followed, I heard something worse. A soft feminine voice, parched by confinement, yet still recognizably human. "Please," it whispered. "I've been so hungry for so long." I fled upward, securing the trap door behind me. As dawn broke over the cemetery, I noticed fresh flowers on Elizabeth's family crypt, roses precisely arranged, with a card bearing only today's date. The local florist confirmed they were ordered anonymously from abroad, paid for by wire transfer from an account in Transylvania that had been making the same annual purchase for over a century. In the months following my encounter beneath the yew tree, I became consumed by questions that rational investigation couldn't answer. The lead box remained sealed. I lacked both courage and authority to open it, but its contents haunted my research and dreams. The village itself seemed to exhale with relief after my visit, as though my acknowledgement of their burden somehow lightened it. Several residents approached me with family heirlooms and stories previously kept hidden. Among these treasures was a velvet-bound diary belonging to Elizabeth's lady's maid, revealing the young woman's transformation in intimate detail. Miss Elizabeth's teeth fell out over 3 nights. One entry read, "I gathered them from her pillow each morning." The new ones grew before my eyes while I brushed her hair, sharp and white as winter frost. She no longer required my help with the mirror, saying her reflection had departed to make room for what was coming. The university archives yielded correspondence between Dr. Harrington and specialists across Europe, including one Professor Abraham Van Helsing from Amsterdam, who sent detailed instructions for the containment ritual performed beneath the yew. His letters expressed grave concern that partial measures create greater dangers than the complete form of the Nosferatu. Most revealing was my discovery of Elizabeth's mother's commitment papers to an asylum in 1904. Her diagnosed hysteria stemmed from claims that her daughter visited her bedroom window nightly, floating 3 stories above the garden, unchanged by death, begging entrance. She died, still institutionalized. Her body returned to the village, but buried with protective measures similar to Elizabeth's. The photographer's camera, which I continued to study, contained microscopic smears of a substance modern analysis identified as human saliva, mixed with an unidentifiable protein structure. The laboratory noted its similarity to compounds found in certain South American bat species, though genetically distinct from any known mammalian profile. I arranged to interview descendants of original funeral attendees, assembling a more complete picture of the moments after the photograph was taken. Recurring in these family stories was mention of Elizabeth's eyes, described as visibly changing color, from brown to a red like cooling embers when the coffin moved. My research led me to believe something crucial had been overlooked. Cross-referencing parish birth records with Elizabeth's documented age revealed an anomaly. She was not 22 at death as reported, but 27. 5 years of her life appeared deliberately obscured, coinciding with the Caldwell family's extended European tour. What they called a continental education may have been something far more sinister, perhaps a confinement or treatment for her initial transformation, or years spent in the company of the mysterious Count. I've arranged transport of ground-penetrating radar to examine the area beneath the yew tree more thoroughly. Preliminary scans suggest the chamber extends further than my initial exploration revealed, with a narrow passage leading toward the village itself. Most disturbing of all, the tapping has resumed in my recordings, though I wasn't recording during my visit to the chamber. Somehow the sounds have transferred to my equipment, audible only when played at midnight. Each night they grow louder, more insistent, accompanied now by faint scratching as though something seeks escape through the very audio files I've collected. The silver key remains cold in my possession, though I've locked it away. Yet each morning I find it removed from its secure location, resting on my bedside table, arranged precisely as though some invisible hand were extending an invitation I dare not accept. The village church bells tolled midnight as I reviewed my files, their distant chime carrying through my open window with unusual clarity. The air felt suddenly dense, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms rise. My recorder switched on by itself, its digital display flickering as that now familiar tapping emanated from its speaker, but different tonight, organized into distinct patterns, not random noise but deliberate communication. I found myself transcribing the sounds, translating them through an old Morse code book I'd acquired during my research. The message chilled me. "I know you listen." The photograph on my desk, that infamous funeral image, had changed subtly. Though physically identical, something about the perspective seemed altered, as if the viewpoint had shifted slightly toward the coffin. Elizabeth's family members, arranged in the front row, now appeared to be leaning away from the casket rather than toward it in concern. A knock at my door startled me. The innkeeper stood outside, elderly and trembling, clutching a yellowed envelope. "This arrived for you," she whispered, though no delivery person came. The letter bore my name in elegant feminine script. The handwriting matched precisely the samples of Elizabeth's correspondence I'd studied. Inside was a single sheet of modern stationery, the ink still wet. The living think transformation happens all at once. It does not. It happens across decades, across centuries. I am more patient than they understood. Tucked within was a photograph I recognized immediately. It showed me kneeling beneath the yew tree, though I'd been alone that night. The perspective came from below, from the open trapdoor itself. The local library's genealogical database yielded the final piece I'd overlooked. The village bloodlines showed a pattern invisible unless one tracked maternal lineage specifically. Every generation since Elizabeth's death, one female child had been born with a distinctive birthmark, a pattern of 3 small dots on the inner wrist, precisely like those visible in the funeral photograph on Elizabeth's exposed hand. These women, scattered across generations, all reported vivid recurring dreams of a beautiful lady who whispers family secrets. Each had unusual longevity and remarkable resistance to illness. Each donated blood regularly to the village hospital. The current bearer of the birthmark was the doctor who had analyzed my recordings weeks earlier. I called the laboratory immediately. The technician who answered sounded puzzled. "Dr. Matthews? She's not been here for decades." That department was renamed after her death in 1976. Yet I had email correspondence with her dated last week. Her signature line included a quotation I had overlooked. "Some legacies flow through the blood." My digital recorder continues its midnight tapping. I've deciphered tonight's message. Division preserves me, reunion awakens me. I understand now what Father Collins meant. Elizabeth was never truly contained. She dispersed herself through bloodlines, through generations, fragments of consciousness waiting to reunite. The box beneath the yew tree holds only the original vessel, while her essence flows through unwitting descendants, each carrying a splinter of her hunger, her patience, her terrible will. The key grows colder each night, and I've discovered a birthmark forming on my wrist. My reflection changes when I stare too long in the mirror. The features remain my own, but something behind my eyes shifts, a presence gazing out through my pupils. 3 small dots on my wrist have darkened to blood red, pulsing in time with that relentless tapping that now follows me everywhere. Last night I awoke to find myself standing in the village cemetery, soil beneath my fingernails. The trapdoor beneath the yew tree stood open, though I have no memory of using the key. The lead box remained sealed, but something had changed. The silver chains hung looser, as though the metal had stretched slightly. The tapping from within had stopped, replaced by a soft humming that matched perfectly the lullaby Elizabeth's mother reportedly sang to her as a child. I've discovered why the village residents seemed relieved by my investigations. They believe I've accepted a burden passed down through generations, the role of watcher. Each era, someone must acknowledge the truth of what lies beneath the yew, reinforcing the communal memory that keeps Elizabeth contained. The innkeeper now looks at me with a mixture of pity and gratitude, leaving traditional protections outside my door each night. Sprigs of herbs, small silver trinkets. The Historical Society has withdrawn access to their archives, citing renovation work. When I pressed the curator, she whispered, "You've seen enough." More knowledge only creates more surface area for attachment. I understand her meaning now. Each fact I've uncovered about Elizabeth has created a connection, a strand of intellectual intimacy that somehow feeds whatever force radiates from that lid box. My dreams are increasingly invaded by images of Elizabeth's life, not the documented events from my research, but intimate moments no historical record could contain. The feel of silk against her skin when she first wore mourning clothes for her grandfather, the taste of wine from the Count's own glass, the exhilaration of her first night flight above the village rooftops. These are not visions a researcher should possess. They come with emotional resonance too powerful to be imagination. Dr. Matthews, the woman supposedly dead since 1976, appeared at my guest house yesterday. Her eyes held the same shifting quality I now see in my mirror. "The bloodline isn't the only way she spreads," she told me. "Knowledge creates pathways too. You've read her letters, touched objects she touched, breathed the air above her remains. You've made yourself receptive." Before leaving, she pressed a small vial into my hand. "When it becomes unbearable, drink this. It won't stop what's happening, but it will slow the convergence. We've kept her fragmented for over a century this way, each of us carrying just a splinter so no single vessel becomes strong enough for complete manifestation. The liquid in the vial pulses with the same rhythm as my birthmark. I understand now. It contains blood from others like me, diluting Elizabeth's essence through shared burden. The silver key no longer feels cold. It's warm now, like flesh. The ancient ritual of blood sharing is older than this village, predating Elizabeth by countless centuries. The vial I now possess echoes practices from the Carpathian Mountains, where isolated communities discovered that by distributing a supernatural presence among many vessels, they could prevent complete manifestation in any single host. My research into these traditions led me to a weathered text in the Cambridge University archives, preserved by scholars who understood more than their published works ever revealed. The manuscript details how Romanian villagers near Bistrița would conduct ceremonies of fragmentary containment, deliberately spreading a powerful entity across multiple bloodlines to weaken its collective force. The villagers called such entities the Divided Ones, immortal but incomplete, eternally seeking reunification like scattered puzzle pieces yearning to form a whole. I've noted with growing alarm that my appetite has changed. Food brings no satisfaction, yet the scent of the innkeeper's paper cut yesterday triggered an overwhelming response I barely controlled. The birthmark pulses stronger with proximity to others bearing similar marks. 5 villagers now avoid my gaze in public, each touching their wrists instinctively when I pass. The church organist, Margaret Fuller, finally approached me after Sunday service. Her bloodshot eyes suggested sleepless nights that matched my own. "We bear it together," she whispered. "The burden passes partially through blood, but also through knowledge and proximity. Those who learn too much become vessels by choice or accident." The original carriers were 7 funeral attendees who witnessed her first attempt at rising. Their descendants continue the containment. She showed me her wrist, where 7 small dots formed a pattern identical to the stars of the Pleiades constellation. The astronomical connection cannot be coincidence. Ancient texts refer to these stars as the 7 sisters, a cosmic reflection of the 7 original bloodlines now carrying fragments of Elizabeth. I've begun mapping the village residents, noting birthmarks and family connections. A geometric pattern emerges when plotted on the village map, a 7-fold symmetry with the yew tree at its center. The original containment ritual apparently utilized sacred geometry, binding Elizabeth not just through physical separation, but through mathematical principles that transcend ordinary space. Yesterday, I experienced my first episode of lost time. I awoke in Elizabeth's family crypt, somehow having gained entry despite the iron door. My digital recorder captured words in my voice, but not my speech patterns. The division weakens as bloodlines thin. Modern lives scatter descendants beyond the boundary stones. The pattern fragments. 3 points are sufficient for triangulation. 3 vessels will complete what 7 sought to prevent. The most disturbing development is my new certainty about Elizabeth's intention. She never sought escape from the box itself. The containment wasn't imprisonment, but preservation, keeping her original form safe while she gradually extended herself through the community that thought they were protecting themselves. Each watcher didn't inherit a burden. They received a gift, a fragment deliberately placed, growing slowly through generations until the constellation of carriers would be complete. And now I know with bone-deep certainty that I am the final point in her design, the convergence she has waited over a century to achieve. The answer to Elizabeth's final transformation became clear as I discovered parish registrar notes hidden within the binding of church accounting books. The registrar, believing some truths too dangerous for ordinary archives, had concealed his most disturbing observations where only the most determined researcher would find them. "The division follows sacred mathematical principles," he wrote in 1907. As Dr. Harrington explained before his death, the fragmentation must maintain precise proportions. The essence separated into 7 cannot reunite until reduced to 3, then 1. This sequence follows the Fibonacci pattern backward, compression rather than expansion. The implications horrified me. Elizabeth hadn't been randomly spreading herself through bloodlines. She was following an arcane formula. Each generation reduced the number of carriers while increasing the potency of what each contained. What began as 7 diluted fragments was now concentrated in just 3 vessels. Myself, Dr. Matthews, and Margaret Fuller. My recurring dreams now included knowledge I couldn't possibly possess. The exact weight of Elizabeth's coffin, the precise temperature of the Count's skin against her throat, the taste of her first feeding. The village library yielded one final revelation when I examined the original photograph under ultraviolet light. Invisible markings appeared around the coffin in the funeral image, a heptagram drawn in a substance that could only be blood, with Elizabeth at its center. The 7 points corresponded precisely to where the original witnesses stood when she first attempted to rise. The ritual hadn't imprisoned Elizabeth. It had enacted the first stage of her transformation. Each subsequent generation of Watchers unknowingly continued the process, concentrating her essence through fewer vessels until she reached the threshold for complete manifestation. Harold Finch found me researching these geometric principles and placed a worn leather journal before me. "My grandfather's final testament," he said. "He was the 7th original. This explains everything." The journal detailed how Elizabeth had orchestrated her own apparent death, having learned from the Count that true immortality required not just blood transformation, but a ritual of division and reunion. The consumption diagnosis provided perfect cover, while her death initiated the century-long process. "We thought ourselves clever," the journal concluded. "We believed we contained the evil, never understanding we were merely vessels in a transformation more gradual and terrible than any folklore suggested. When the 3 final carriers converge at the appointed time, the division ends. God help those who remain." That appointed time, I now understand, corresponds to the upcoming lunar eclipse, exactly 120 years after Elizabeth's funeral. The astronomical alignment creates the conditions necessary for the final convergence. Dr. Matthews and Margaret Fuller have stopped responding to my messages. The silver key now burns hot against my skin, and the birthmark has spread beyond my wrist, tracing patterns up my arm that match the symbols carved in the chamber beneath the yew tree. I've transcribed these findings and sealed them with the photograph in a package to be delivered after the eclipse. Whether as warning or confession, I cannot say. The hunger grows. The tapping has stopped. Now I hear only Elizabeth's laughter, originating not from my recordings but from somewhere deep within myself. The eclipse approaches tomorrow night. I write these words with a trembling hand, struggling to maintain control of my own body as Elizabeth's presence grows stronger within me. Last night I dreamed of flying above the village, seeing it through her eyes, the thatched roofs from a century ago overlaid with modern structures, past and present merging in her perception. I've located Father Collins's personal Bible, preserved in the church vestry. The margins contain his coded observations about the ritual performed beneath the yew tree. "Not 7 witnesses by accident," he wrote, "but by Elizabeth's design. She chose us specifically, 7 bloodlines with particular qualities. The physician whose knowledge of anatomy would serve her transformation. The priest whose crisis of faith would create spiritual vulnerability. The photographer whose images would spread awareness beyond the village boundary. Each of the 7 brought something essential to her fragmentation and eventual resurrection. The containment was never about protection, it was about preparation. I've managed to find Dr. Matthews's laboratory notes. Before her supposed death, she had been studying genetic anomalies in the village bloodlines. Her research revealed a frightening pattern. Each generation of carriers showed subtle mutations in their DNA, changes that enhanced longevity, sensory perception, and most troublingly, cellular regeneration capabilities. We weren't just carrying Elizabeth's consciousness. Our bodies were being slowly prepared to host something more than human. Margaret Fuller finally contacted me through a letter left at my door. "I've fought this longer than you can imagine," she wrote. 5 decades of resistance. The others before us didn't understand what 3 final vessels meant. Only one will remain after the convergence. Elizabeth needs just one perfected body, not 3. We are not sharing her. We are competing to become her. The village has emptied mysteriously. Shops closed without explanation. Homes standing vacant with doors left ajar. The remaining residents seem to be following some unspoken evacuation plan, generations in preparation. They know what's coming. I found historical weather records indicating that on the night of Elizabeth's funeral, an unexpected storm had prevented a full lunar eclipse scheduled for that evening. Tomorrow night completes the interrupted astronomical alignment from a century ago. Most disturbing was my discovery in the soil beneath the yew tree this morning. Fragments of corroded lead scattered among the roots. The box is deteriorating from within, weakened by decades of patient effort. Whatever remains inside has nearly freed itself. The Caldwell family crest, which I previously overlooked, features 3 interlocking circles with a divided serpent at their center. Their family motto, when properly translated from Latin, reads not strength and faith, as commonly reported, but divided only to conquer. I feel Elizabeth's anticipation building within me like a gathering storm. The birthmark now covers my entire arm, intricate patterns mapping what I recognize as the village itself, with the yew tree at its heart. My reflection shows my eyes changing color with each passing hour, shifting from my natural color toward something darker, hungrier. The key has melted in my palm, the silver flowing into my skin like quicksilver, leaving no wound but a perfect keyhole pattern where it was absorbed. Tomorrow night, 3 will become 1, and Elizabeth will walk again. The full moon hung suspended above the village like a pale sentinel, its light streaming through my window and illuminating my transformed hand. The keyhole pattern where the silver had melted into my flesh now glowed with an inner light, pulsing in rhythm with the approaching eclipse. My reflection had become almost unrecognizable, my features shifting subtly between my own and Elizabeth's, as though 2 photographs were being superimposed with increasing precision. I found myself drawn to the church, my footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The village silence was absolute. Not even insects dared sing tonight. The church door swung open at my approach. Though I hadn't touched it, Dr. Matthews waited inside, standing before the altar. The birthmark had spread across her face in an intricate lacework pattern, her eyes now entirely crimson. Margaret Fuller knelt in the front pew, weeping silently, her hands clasped in what might have been prayer or surrender. "You've brought something," Dr. Matthews said, her voice carrying harmonics I'd never heard in human speech before. I hadn't realized I was carrying anything, yet my hand produced a small velvet pouch I'd found among Elizabeth's belongings at the Historical Society. Inside lay 3 items: a tarnished silver thimble, a lock of dark hair bound with ribbon, and a yellowed human tooth filed to a point. "The final relics," Margaret whispered, physical fragments of her original form, kept separate from the lead box as additional insurance. "By bringing them here, you've chosen yourself as the primary vessel." I wanted to protest that I'd done no such thing, yet some deeper part of me, the part that was becoming Elizabeth, felt triumph. "The convergence requires proximity," Dr. Matthews continued. "As the eclipse reaches totality, only one vessel will remain." Elizabeth understood that immortality requires sacrifice. Her fragmented consciousness has existed in agonizing division for a century. Tonight, she becomes whole again. The church windows suddenly reflected the approaching shadow of the eclipse, the moon's light dimming perceptibly. I felt Elizabeth surging within me, memories cascading through my consciousness. Not just her human life, but the decades since, experienced through countless partial vessels, fragments of awareness filtered through generations of unwitting carriers. "She chose well with you," Margaret said, rising unsteadily. "A researcher drawn to mysteries, someone who would uncover rather than conceal. Every discovery you made strengthened her within you. Every connection you formed with her past fed her presence." Dr. Matthews approached me, her movements unnaturally fluid. "The original 7 contained equal portions of her essence, but the 3 of us are not equal now. You've become her favorite." The church bells began tolling without human assistance, marking 15 minutes until totality. I felt a sudden crawling sensation beneath my skin, as though something was rearranging my very cellular structure. The birthmark patterns on all 3 of us began to glow with the same silver-blue luminescence as my keyhole scar. "We should proceed to the yew tree," Dr. Matthews said. "The geometric alignment must be perfect, church, crypt, and chamber forming the points of convergence." As we moved toward the door, I noticed the stained glass depicting St. Michael had changed. The saint's face now wore an expression of defeat, and the feminine figure beneath his feet was rising rather than vanquished. Outside, the moon hung blood-red in partial eclipse, and a figure waited beneath the yew tree, a silhouette composed of shadow and hunger, arms outstretched in welcome. The convergence ritual began as we formed a triangle around the yew tree, our positions corresponding to the ancient markers buried beneath the soil. The figure composed of shadow remained at the center, more presence than substance, watching with patient hunger as the eclipse approached totality. Our birthmarks burned with increasing intensity, veins of silver light spreading across our skin like luminous webs. "She's been feeding on the village for generations," Margaret whispered, her voice growing weaker as the shadows deepened. "Not just blood, but fear and memory." Every retelling of her story strengthened her. Every nightmare about her fed her return. The earth beneath the yew tree began to crumble without being touched, soil sinking inward to reveal the chamber below. The lead box was now completely corroded, its fragments scattered like discarded skin. In its place lay something that resembled a human heart, impossibly preserved, pulsing with unnatural vigor. "The final anchor," Dr. Matthews said, her words slurring as her features became less distinct. Her original heart, removed by the Count during her transformation and preserved as the seed from which she would grow again. I felt Elizabeth pushing against the boundaries of my consciousness, memories flooding through me that weren't mine. The sweet copper taste of her first human blood, the sensation of bones reshaping themselves during her transformation, the patient darkness of decades spent in fragmented awareness. The moon disappeared completely, plunging us into a darkness broken only by the silver light emanating from our transformed bodies. Dr. Matthews suddenly gasped, her outline becoming transparent as though she were being erased from existence. The patterns on her skin detached like glowing smoke, flowing toward me in ribbons of light. "She's chosen," Margaret sobbed, backing away. "You're the vessel. You've won." But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like drowning in someone else's existence, my own identity compressed into an increasingly smaller corner of consciousness. I fought to maintain some sense of self as Elizabeth's presence expanded within me. The shadowy figure at the center solidified slightly, taking on more definite features. A woman's form in Victorian dress, her face still obscured but becoming clearer with each passing second. She reached toward me with hands that seemed composed of night itself. "A century of patience," she spoke, her voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "A century of division. But you found all the pieces, little researcher. You solved the puzzle I laid out so carefully." The heart in the open chamber began to rise, floating upward on unseen currents. Dr. Matthews collapsed to her knees, her body becoming translucent as more of her essence flowed toward me. In desperation, I clutched the small velvet pouch containing Elizabeth's relics. Something about these fragments felt important beyond their obvious connection to her. They weren't just remnants but keys to understanding the true nature of the ritual. The floating heart rotated slowly, positioning itself toward my chest as though preparing to replace my own. The eclipse reached perfect totality above us, and Margaret Fuller's form began dissolving like Dr. Matthews, streams of silver light pouring from her disintegrating body into mine. The shadowy Elizabeth smiled with teeth that gleamed in the darkness, her face finally becoming visible, beautiful, terrible, and triumphant after a century of divided existence. "Together at last," she whispered, reaching for her levitating heart. "After tonight, there will only be us." In desperation, I grasped the relics, understanding finally washing over me like cold water. The fragmentation hadn't been Elizabeth's strategy for resurrection. It had been the Count's method of control. These weren't just keepsakes. They were fail-safes designed by those who truly understood what Elizabeth was becoming. "You're not collecting yourself," I gasped, fighting against the tide of alien memories flooding my consciousness. "You're being collected." The shadowy Elizabeth faltered, her expression shifting from triumph to uncertainty. The thimble, I realized, had belonged to Elizabeth's mother, a woman who practiced protective folk magic beneath a veneer of Victorian propriety. The hair bound with ribbon came not from Elizabeth, but from her younger sister Catherine, the only family member who had suspected the truth from the beginning. And the tooth was never Elizabeth's at all. It belonged to the Count himself. As the eclipse reached its absolute peak, I pressed the relics against my transformed skin where the keyhole pattern glowed brightest. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The floating heart convulsed, its rhythmic pulsing becoming erratic. The silver streams flowing from Dr. Matthews and Margaret reversed direction, flowing back into their fading forms. "No!" the shadow Elizabeth screamed, her voice distorting into something inhuman. "A century of planning was never yours," I interrupted, understanding flowing through me. "You were never Elizabeth. You're what the Count placed inside her, a fragment of himself divided and hidden, using her bloodline as your vessel." The historical pieces aligned with terrible clarity. The Count hadn't transformed Elizabeth out of love or even hunger. He had used her as a repository, a hiding place for his essence when vampire hunters had closed in on him in Europe. Her transformation was merely the first stage of his own planned resurrection. The shadow began to tear apart, shreds of darkness dispersing into the night air. The heart dropped heavily to the ground, withering like fruit left in the sun. Dr. Matthews and Margaret Fuller solidified, their forms becoming substantial again, though they remained unconscious. The birthmarks on my skin burned painfully, then began to fade as the moon slowly emerged from shadow. The keyhole pattern on my palm glowed one final time before dissolving into a simple scar. In the distance, lights appeared in village windows. Residents were returning, somehow sensing the danger had passed. I collected the withered heart and decaying relics, knowing they required proper disposal. True destruction this time, not merely containment. The ashes would need to be scattered across running water, the remains blessed by traditions older than Christianity. As dawn approached, I helped Dr. Matthews and Margaret to their feet. The three of us looked at each other with new understanding, free of Elizabeth's presence but forever marked by our encounter with her. No, not with her. With what had been using her name. The true Elizabeth Caldwell, I now realized, had died a century ago, her body used as a vessel and her identity stolen by something ancient and patient, something that had waited beneath the yew tree, divided but not defeated, until someone like me came searching for answers. The photographs don't lie, though I sometimes wish they would. The three remaining vessels, myself, Dr. Matthews, and Margaret Fuller, appear physically unchanged since that night beneath the yew tree. Yet villagers regard us with quiet reverence, offering small nods of acknowledgement as we pass in the street. We've become custodians of a secret that spans generations. The withered heart and relics have been properly disposed of, cremated at midnight during a new moon, their ashes scattered across the confluence where three rivers meet beyond the village boundaries. Ancient traditions demanded specific rituals, which we performed under Harold Finch's watchful guidance. His family had maintained knowledge of the proper disposal methods for centuries, waiting for this moment. "The Count's essence is truly gone," Dr. Matthews assured me yesterday as we catalogued Elizabeth's actual possessions, items untainted by malevolent influence. But the village memory remains. This will become legend within a generation, the truth distorted by time. The church has been reconsecrated, though Father Wilson reports parishioners still avoid sitting in the front pews where Margaret Fuller knelt during our confrontation. The stained glass window has mysteriously reverted to its original form, St. Michael once again triumphant rather than defeated. I've begun interviewing the 7 bloodline families, recording their stories for a comprehensive archive that will preserve truth alongside legend. Each family maintained different fragments of knowledge, protective measures, warning signs, small rituals performed on children when they reached adolescence. None possessed the complete picture by careful design. The Caldwell family vault has been permanently sealed with concrete and blessed objects from 7 religious traditions. Modern archaeological techniques confirmed no remains exist within. Elizabeth's actual body had been completely consumed during the initial ritual, her physical form sacrificed to house the Count's divided essence. Margaret Fuller speaks now of sensations she can't quite explain, moments when she feels Elizabeth's genuine presence, not the malevolence that wore her identity, but something sorrowful and human. "I believe a fragment of her true self survived," Margaret told me, not seeking resurrection or revenge, but simply acknowledgement. In response, we've established a small memorial garden where Elizabeth's home once stood. Historical records confirm she was an avid botanist before meeting the Count. Her greenhouse, once famous throughout the county. The village children leave wildflowers there, no longer afraid of her name. My research continues, focused now on other instances throughout history where similar fragmentations might have occurred. Dr. Matthews has identified 3 possible cases across Europe, each involving unexplained phenomena centered around a single family line following contact with Transylvanian nobility. The birthmark on my wrist has faded to almost nothing, though in certain lights, the pattern briefly reappears, a reminder of how close we came to unknowingly resurrecting something ancient and terrible. I still dream of Elizabeth occasionally, not the creature assembled from shadow beneath the yew tree, but a young woman with intelligent eyes and ambitions beyond her time. In these dreams, she simply says, "Thank you," before dissolving into morning light. The village cemetery has changed since that night beneath the yew. Wildflowers now grow around the ancient tree, their colors vibrant against the weathered gravestones. I visit weekly, leaving nothing but taking careful photographs that show no anomalies beyond ordinary light and shadow. The documentation compulsion remains, though its purpose has transformed from investigation to preservation. Elizabeth's personal effects, recovered from various historical collections, have been assembled in a small museum display that tells her true story. A promising young botanist whose research into rare medicinal plants had drawn academic interest before her fateful European tour. Her actual notebooks, discovered in a university archive where they'd been misfiled for decades, reveal a scientific mind fascinated by folklore surrounding plants associated with protection against supernatural entities. Local belief suggests garlic's effectiveness stems not from superstition, but chemical properties that inhibit blood-borne parasites, she wrote in one entry. Count D disputes this scientific explanation, though he refuses handling specimens despite my repeated requests for assistance with classification. These writings suggest Elizabeth had begun suspecting her mentor's nature before her transformation. The Count had not found a willing disciple, but a clever woman who recognized the danger too late, attempting to document what was happening to her even as she lost control of her own body. The village's annual protection ritual continues, though transformed. What once involved fearful prayers and warding symbols has evolved into a community festival celebrating Elizabeth's liberation. Children perform a traditional dance around the yew tree, retracing the triangular pattern that finally broke the Count's influence. The mathematical precision has been preserved while the meaning has been renewed, no longer containment, but commemoration. Dr. Matthews has established a medical genealogy program, monitoring the 7 bloodlines for lingering effects. The cellular changes appear to be receding with each generation, she explained during our last meeting. Though certain enhancements persist, unusual longevity, heightened sensory perception, remarkable recovery from injuries, not curses but potentially beneficial adaptations. Ancient family journals, previously kept hidden, now circulate among the descendants. These records describe Elizabeth's true nature during those final days, not a monster, but a victim fighting to warn others even as her identity was being consumed. One passage, written by the original church warden, describes her whispering to him during communion the Sunday before her supposed death, "When I am gone, watch for divisions of 7, count backwards from Fibonacci." The pattern reveals his purpose. She had discovered the mathematical structure of the Count's fragmentation ritual and embedded clues within common interactions, knowing her consciousness would soon be suppressed beneath his invasive presence. Most poignant was the discovery of Elizabeth's final personal letter, concealed within the hollow base of her favorite botanical specimen, a pressed autumn crocus preserved in her personal herbarium. The letter, addressed to those who find the truth, contains a simple message: remember me as I was, not as what used to me. The division was never my choice, but the resilience against it might be my legacy. Look for me in unexpected kindnesses and moments of impossible strength. I scattered these as surely as he scattered himself. The photograph remains in my possession, though I've considered destroying it many times. Some artifacts carry too much weight to simply discard. Margaret Fuller suggested we seal it within the church cornerstone during renovations, but Dr. Matthews believes it serves as a necessary reminder of vigilance. Some truths shouldn't be forgotten, she said, studying the image where mourners still rise in eternal alarm, even when they're painful. The village has found an unexpected peace in acknowledging Elizabeth's true story. Tourism has increased, though visitors seeking supernatural thrills often leave disappointed by the scholarly presentation at our small museum. They want vampires and coffins. We give them botanical journals and Victorian medical ethics. Research continues into the Count's origins. Historical records suggest his lineage traced back to medieval nobility, who practiced ancient blood rituals long before modern vampire mythology coalesced. The fragmentation technique appears in obscure texts from at least 6 different cultures, always as a method for extending influence beyond physical limitations. Harold Finch recently discovered a buried stone marker at the cemetery's edge, its surface carved with 7 interconnected circles. Ground-penetrating radar revealed similar markers forming a perfect heptagram around the village perimeter, invisible guardians that had subtly influenced events for generations. Geography as ritual, Dr. Matthews explained. The village itself was the containment circle. Every building, every road placed according to mathematical principles that prevented complete manifestation. My dreams of Elizabeth have evolved. She appears now in modern dress, her expressions animated with genuine emotion rather than hunger. In the most recent visitation, she stood in a sunlit garden, holding a botanical specimen with obvious delight. Not everything carried forward was his. she told me. Some fragments were truly mine. The birthmark reappears on my wrist during certain astronomical alignments, though without the previous burning sensation. Margaret experiences the same phenomenon, leading us to suspect we still carry something of Elizabeth, not the Count's malevolence but fragments of her authentic self, preserved through our connection to her story. Community healing continues through unexpected channels. Local schools have incorporated Elizabeth's botanical research into their science curriculum. Her detailed illustrations of medicinal plants now appear in textbooks, her name rightfully credited after a century of obscurity. The church bell tower, damaged during our confrontation, has been restored with a new carillon that plays hymns at sunset, not as protection, but celebration. The composition includes 7 bell tones arranged in a backwards Fibonacci sequence, mathematically significant in ways only a few understand. Yesterday, I found a pressed autumn crocus on my doorstep, Elizabeth's signature flower. No note accompanied it, but none was needed. Some connections transcend complete explanation, remaining in the liminal space between history and mystery. The photograph endures, a portal to a moment when division was mistaken for containment, when a woman's identity was nearly erased beneath layers of legend. Like the village itself, it contains both shadow and illumination, depending on how closely one chooses to look. The final truth about Elizabeth Caldwell emerged not through research or ritual, but through silence. As autumn leaves drifted across the cemetery, I sat beneath the ancient yew, notebook empty, recorder switched off. No active investigation, just quiet contemplation after months of frantic discovery. A gentle breeze stirred the branches overhead, and I felt, rather than heard, Elizabeth's presence, a whisper of awareness without words. The mathematical patterns that once governed her fragmentation had transformed into something organic, following natural rhythms rather than arcane formulas. "You were never meant to be contained," I said aloud to the empty air, "or resurrected. You were meant to be understood." The village archives had yielded their final secret last week. Elizabeth's original research proposal to the Royal Botanical Society, submitted months before her fateful European tour. Her studies focused not on ordinary plants but on folkloric specimens believed to grant longevity or prevent death. The Count hadn't selected Elizabeth randomly. He'd discovered her research and recognized someone already seeking what he offered, though with scientific purpose rather than supernatural hunger. Her transformation began not with his bite, but with her curiosity, the questions that led her to his castle, and ultimately to her doom. Dr. Matthews confirmed what I'd long suspected. The birthmarks weren't a sign of possession but of protection. Elizabeth had encoded her own essence into these patterns, creating a defense mechanism against complete assimilation. What we interpreted as the Count's fragmentation strategy had been partially subverted by Elizabeth's botanical knowledge, plant-derived compounds that preserved fragments of her true self within the 7 bloodlines. The museum display now includes this final chapter, how a young scientist's work was twisted toward dark purpose, yet contained within itself the seeds of eventual liberation. Visitors no longer leave disappointed but thoughtful, recognizing in Elizabeth's story something universally human, the struggle to maintain identity against forces that would consume it. The photograph's power has faded, its sepia tones no longer seeming ominous but simply aged. The faces of funeral attendees reveal not just horror but determination, the beginning of resistance rather than surrender. Even in that captured moment of crisis, something remarkable was forming, a community united against darkness. Margaret Fuller plays Elizabeth's recovered musical compositions during village gatherings, melodies that survived when other aspects of her identity were suppressed. The rhythms contain the same mathematical sequences as the protection rituals, suggesting Elizabeth embedded her knowledge in art when direct communication became impossible. As twilight descended over the cemetery, I noticed fresh autumn crocuses blooming around the yew's roots, plants that shouldn't thrive in such deep shade. Their purple blossoms formed a perfect 7-pointed star, nature reclaiming mathematical precision on its own terms. I understood then that Elizabeth Caldwell wasn't just preserved in bloodlines or birthmarks, artifacts or archives. She lived in this moment of recognition, in the community that finally separated her true legacy from the darkness that had nearly consumed it. Not a horror story, but a testament to resilience, to fragments of identity preserved against impossible odds until they could finally be reassembled with understanding rather than fear. The transformation of the village continues through subtle shifts that most residents barely notice. Each season brings new autumn crocuses in unexpected places. Window boxes, garden borders, even cracks in the sidewalk outside the Historical Society. Their appearance coincides with astronomical alignments matching those from 1903, creating a blooming calendar of supernatural precision. Elizabeth's presence manifests in ways science struggles to explain. Children born to the 7 bloodlines occasionally hum melodies they couldn't possibly know. Compositions Elizabeth wrote before her death. Soil samples from the cemetery show unprecedented regenerative properties that agricultural researchers have begun studying for potential medical applications. Most remarkable was last month's discovery during church renovations. Workers removing the original altar found a small tin box containing a daguerreotype dating to 1898, showing Elizabeth in the Count's castle laboratory. Not as victim but collaborator, both figures bent over botanical specimens with scientific instruments. The image reveals what written records couldn't. Elizabeth had been pursuing immortality through botanical compounds before the Count introduced his blood-based alternative. Her journals, when re-examined with this knowledge, reveal coded references to dual-path immortality, plants and blood combined in ways neither science nor supernatural lore had previously attempted. The Count hadn't corrupted her research. He had hijacked it, recognizing its potential to solve limitations in his own immortality. Her division across 7 bloodlines wasn't just his strategy for resurrection, but her emergency preservation of the botanical component he couldn't absorb. The village protection ritual, maintained for generations through superstition, unconsciously preserved the exact environmental conditions Elizabeth's botanical experiments required. The geometric pattern of buildings, the timing of church bells, even the composition of cemetery soil, all maintained precise conditions for something to grow unseen beneath the surface of community life. What rises now isn't Elizabeth or the Count, but something neither could have achieved alone. A synthesis of botanical immortality and blood regeneration that manifests not in a single resurrected form, but in community-wide resilience. Village residents heal faster than medical science can explain. Plants grow in impossible conditions. The boundary between life and death seems gentler here. I understand now why Elizabeth's presence feels strongest not beneath the yew tree, but in the community garden established on the grounds of her former home. She achieved her immortality, not through conquest, but through contribution. Scientific knowledge preserved and slowly integrated into the very ecosystem of the village. The photograph that began my investigation hangs now in the church vestibule, no longer an artifact of horror, but a moment of transformation captured. What those funeral attendees witnessed wasn't just a coffin's movement, but the beginning of something unprecedented. Death and life renegotiating their boundaries through science and sacrifice. Elizabeth's final triumph wasn't escaping death, but reimagining it, not as ending but as change, as continuation through community rather than individual persistence. The autumn crocuses have begun appearing in neighboring villages now, spreading outward in concentric rings that follow the Fibonacci sequence. Botanical societies have taken notice, publishing papers on the unprecedented migration pattern of a flower that typically requires specific soil conditions, now thriving across varied terrain. None of these scientists connect the phenomenon to Elizabeth Caldwell, seeing only the botanical mystery rather than its supernatural architect. I've remained in the village, unable to leave what feels increasingly like the epicenter of a subtle revolution. Dr. Matthews has converted her laboratory to study the unusual properties of local plants, focusing particularly on their accelerated healing capabilities. 3 pharmaceutical companies have approached her with research grants after village residents demonstrated recovery rates that defy medical norms. "We're becoming something new," Margaret Fuller confided during our weekly meeting at the cemetery. "Not vessels or carriers anymore, but cultivators." Her music students have begun composing pieces that incorporate Elizabeth's mathematical patterns without being taught them explicitly. The melodies emerge organically, as though the village itself vibrates at frequencies that influence creative expression. Harold Finch discovered something remarkable while expanding the community garden. Beneath the soil lies an intricate network of roots forming the same heptagram pattern as the stone markers surrounding the village. Dating techniques suggest these roots are over a century old, yet still living, connected to no visible plants, yet nourishing the soil throughout the community. She created a mycelial network before modern science understood such things existed, Dr. Matthews explained, examining soil samples under her microscope. The division wasn't just of her consciousness, but her botanical research, implemented covertly while everyone focused on supernatural threats. The implications extend beyond our village. 3 residents who moved away decades ago have returned, drawn by inexplicable homesickness that resolved only upon crossing the village boundary. Each brought autumn crocus seeds collected from their distant gardens, completing a biological circuit that Elizabeth apparently designed to eventually reconnect. Most profound was the change to the funeral photograph itself. Conservators noticed the image shifting subtly under certain light conditions, the expressions of horror transforming into recognition when viewed through ultraviolet filters. Elizabeth had embedded a secondary image within the chemical composition of the photograph, one that would only become perceptible after sufficient time had passed. In this hidden layer, the mourners aren't recoiling from something terrifying, but reaching toward something transformative. Elizabeth's coffin appears surrounded not by shadows, but by luminous botanical patterns, identical to those now emerging throughout the village landscape. She knew photography would advance enough to eventually reveal this, the conservator explained. The chemical compounds she added to the original development process were designed to gradually emerge over decades, protecting the true image until the village was ready to perceive it. The Count sought immortality through domination. Elizabeth achieved it through patience, through seeds planted in soil and consciousness, germinating across generations until conditions proved suitable for full bloom. What rises in our village isn't resurrection, but revelation. The gradual unveiling of a botanical metamorphosis that transforms not just individuals, but entire ecosystems. The photograph now rests in a custom-built case of glass and oak, illuminated by precisely calibrated light that reveals both the original image and Elizabeth's hidden layer simultaneously. Museum curators from London visited to authenticate what they called the first known example of temporal photographic encoding, marveling at techniques that shouldn't have existed in 1903. What they cannot explain, and what the village quietly protects, is how the photograph continues to evolve. Each solstice brings subtle changes, the church interior growing brighter, Elizabeth's coffin appearing increasingly transparent, mourners' expressions shifting from recognition toward something resembling reverence. Those with birthmarks can see further changes invisible to others. Botanical formulas embedded in the background, cellular structures mapped across the church walls, the mathematical sequence of immortality hidden in plain sight. The village has become a pilgrimage site for botanists, though they rarely connect their research with the young woman in our museum. 3 distinct medical breakthroughs have emerged from studying local plant specimens, including a revolutionary wound treatment derived from autumn crocus compounds that regenerate tissue at unprecedented rates. Elizabeth's name appears in no research papers or patents, her contribution moving through the world unmarked yet transformative, precisely as she designed. I've begun dreaming in mathematical sequences, waking with botanical formulas I transcribe before they fade from memory. Dr. Matthews collects these equations, noting their relationship to Elizabeth's original research. She's still working, Matthews observed, using our consciousness as her laboratory, now that her physical form is gone. The birthmarks have stabilized across the 7 bloodlines, no longer fading or intensifying, but maintaining a constant presence, like living tattoos that map the connection between individual and community. Children born with these marks demonstrate unusual aptitudes for both mathematics and botany, their school projects inevitably incorporating heptagram patterns and 7-stage processes. Margaret Fuller completed her symphony last spring, a composition in 7 movements that local musicians performed beneath the yew tree on the anniversary of Elizabeth's funeral. As the final notes faded, attendees reported a momentary shared vision, Elizabeth standing among them in modern dress, notebook in hand, her expression not triumphant but simply satisfied, a researcher observing a successful long-term experiment. The Count's influence has faded to nearly nothing, his hunger for domination overwhelmed by Elizabeth's patient cultivation. The few remaining artifacts associated with him, the pointed tooth, fragments of his correspondence, have lost their psychic charge, becoming merely historical curiosities rather than containers of malevolence. What endures is something neither vampire lore nor botanical science fully explains. A community where the boundary between life and death has grown permeable, not through blood sacrifice, but through mutual exchange, through recognition that immortality achieves its most meaningful expression not in a single persistent consciousness, but in knowledge preserved and shared across generations. The photograph captures this truth better than any written record, a moment of apparent horror transformed through patience and perception into something revelatory. Not an ending, but a transition, visible only to those who understand what Elizabeth always knew. True immortality blooms slowly and with purpose. The autumn crocuses have spread beyond England now, botanical journals reporting their unexpected appearance across Europe in a pattern that, when mapped, traces the exact route of Elizabeth's final journey with the Count. Each bloom site corresponds to a location where she gathered specimens during that fateful tour. DNA analysis shows these widely scattered plants share identical genetic markers despite growing in vastly different environments, an impossibility by conventional science. I've begun cataloging these international manifestations, collaborating with botanists who remain unaware of the flower's true significance. Their research papers describe unprecedented adaptive capabilities and accelerated evolutionary mechanisms, coming tantalizingly close to understanding what Elizabeth achieved without recognizing the architect behind it. Most remarkable was the discovery at the Count's castle ruins in Transylvania, a perfect circle of autumn crocuses surrounding a stone courtyard where no plants had grown for centuries. Local villagers, who had avoided the site for generations, now gather these flowers for medicinal teas that village elders claim grant unusual vitality. Scientists studying these residents have documented cellular regeneration rates that defy medical understanding. The mathematical patterns in Elizabeth's work have attracted attention beyond botanical circles. Theoretical physicists at Cambridge have begun studying what they call the Caldwell sequence, the precise numerical relationship between the 7 bloodlines, 7 village markers, and 7 botanical compounds that Elizabeth integrated into her research. Their papers suggest the sequence creates a self-sustaining entropy system, essentially a mathematical framework for recycling life energy rather than losing it to death. Dr. Matthews and I have carefully monitored these academic developments, providing selected information while protecting the deeper truth. Elizabeth's legacy deserves scientific recognition, yet we understand the dangers of revealing everything too quickly. Some transformations require generations to unfold properly. Yesterday, while organizing Elizabeth's remaining personal effects, I discovered a pressed autumn crocus inside her favorite book, not preserved between pages as expected, but growing through them, its roots threading through the paper without damaging a single word. The book, a first edition of Darwin's Origin of Species, contained margin notes in Elizabeth's hand that take his evolutionary theories in directions he never imagined. Not just adaptation through selection, but conscious direction of biological transformation across generations. The village cemetery has become a living laboratory where the boundary between death and life grows increasingly permeable. Mourners report conversations with recently deceased loved ones that contain information they couldn't possibly know, yet these experiences feel like natural conversations rather than supernatural encounters. The yew tree has begun producing fruit for the first time in centuries, its typically toxic berries modified to contain compounds identical to those in Elizabeth's research. What Elizabeth created wasn't immortality as the Count understood it, the endless persistence of a single consciousness, but something far more profound. She designed a system where life energy transfers and transforms rather than terminates, where knowledge accumulates across generations, where death becomes less an ending than a change in state. The funeral photograph continues its gradual transformation, revealing more of Elizabeth's hidden layer with each passing season. What began as an image of interrupted death has become a document of continuous becoming, the visual record of a moment when humanity's relationship with mortality began an evolution that continues to unfold through soil and bloodline, through science and community, through the patient blooming of flowers that should not exist. The autumn crocuses bloomed in perfect heptagram formation on my desk this morning, emerging from within the sealed glass case that houses the photograph. 7 delicate purple blossoms, their stems somehow passing through solid glass without breaking it, their petals unfurling toward the image they've chosen to accompany. I no longer study the photograph, we commune with it. The distinction matters. What began as investigation has transformed into conversation across the boundary between observer and observed, between present and past, between life and whatever lies beyond it. Elizabeth's legacy continues to expand beyond the village, beyond botanical anomalies and mathematical sequences. Last month, 7 medical researchers working independently across 7 countries simultaneously published findings on cellular regeneration that, when combined, complete her original formula. None have met. None know of their connection. Yet their work forms a perfect whole, as though guided by an invisible hand. The birthmark on my wrist has stabilized into its final form, not a keyhole as I once thought, but a seed. Under microscopic examination, it reveals cellular structures identical to autumn crocus bulbs, dormant yet alive within my skin. Dr. Matthews and Margaret Fuller bear similar markers, each slightly different yet complementary when mapped together. Yesterday, I received a letter from the Cambridge physicist who has been studying the Caldwell sequence. His equations have led him to a remarkable conclusion. What Elizabeth created isn't merely regeneration, but recursion, a system that cycles through death not to avoid it, but to incorporate it, creating not endless life, but endless renewal. The village itself seems to breathe now with conscious purpose. Gardens flourish without tending. Illness rarely takes permanent hold. The cemetery feels less like a place of endings than a nursery for new beginnings, the boundary between memorial and cultivation blurring with each passing season. The final transformation of the photograph completed itself during yesterday's autumn equinox. What once showed a moment of interrupted mourning now reveals a deliberate transition. Elizabeth's coffin appears as a germination chamber, mourners as witnesses not to horror, but to emergence. The church interior glows with botanical equations visible now even to those without birthmarks. The priest's gesture of alarm has become one of blessing. I understand now why this image found its way to shadow frames, not because it captured darkness, but because it documented light mistaken for shadow. Elizabeth Caldwell never sought to cheat death, but to reimagine it, not as cessation, but as transformation, not as ending, but as evolution. The Count has faded entirely from the village consciousness, his hunger for dominance overwhelmed by Elizabeth's patient cultivation. What endures is her vision, immortality achieved not through blood and domination, but through knowledge preserved, through community sustained, through life that recognizes death not as enemy, but as partner in an eternal dance. I place my hand against the glass case, feeling warmth where there should be none. The photograph pulses once with gentle light, the image shifting slightly to show Elizabeth's face turned toward me, her expression one of collegial satisfaction. One researcher acknowledging another across the boundary of time. Another photograph, another dark secret revealed. Until next time, this has been Shadow Frames.